all people gravitate towards things they are inclined to want. And there are those who want power above morality, above sincerity, above anything else. And these are the communists, and they have infiltrated the West since the early 20th century. This may be, for some people, hard to understand. How come I have not heard of them if they have been here for a century? Well, it's because they cover their tracks by wiping out their violent presence in history. The book Days of Rage talks about how they would perform violent attacks on important places in the US, and these things are not talked about in history class in the public school system. What is talked about is the far right, but not the far left in the early 20th century and how violent they were. And a big reason for this, why they appeared here all of a sudden, is mass immigration from countries with communist tendencies, especially Eastern Europe and Italy. That's why a strict migrant policy was put in place during that time to help save the US from falling to ethnicities who have communist tendencies. Now, a decision to do this was seen as racist, but it's not. It's to protect the nation. It is logical that people you give the monopoly on violence protect you, the government, instead of hurting you, like what's happening in the UK in 2024, unfortunately. Now, the communists realized they could not take over the Western states by force, so what they did is they waited upon decades, slowly building up, slowly taking away, in the US especially, the higher education of students. And when you take away people's knowledge, they cannot fight back against you with rhetoric, with speech. And so they have become skinwalkers among us. They have become skinwalkers among us. And for the sake of absolute power, at any cost, they flood their own Western nations with immigrants. And they do it not with the purpose of wanting to bring people in to make the country better, but they do it not looking at the background of people, because some of these people are very dangerous and they are a threat to our society. And the government does not go through the process of attempting to assimilate them into our society. And because of that, these ethnicities have their own values from their own cultures that are not aligned with our own. And so they create their own ethnic conclaves or colonies, and they conquer and colonize us slowly over time, because the communists who are in charge of the West want to have immigrants who are less likely to overthrow the government than the native population. The reason foreigners are less likely to be resentful of a tyrannic regime than natives is that natives have a stake in their own land. They are tied to the history of the land. And the communists who are bringing in these radical Islamists and other natives into the country, they are giving these natives free housing at the expense. They are giving these immigrants free housing at the expense of the native taxpayer. And so the immigrants are then grateful to the communist overlords for giving them these things. And the communists want to break down the natives because the natives are going to resist more than the immigrants. And so, especially when you bring in different kinds of immigrants, you then make everyone below you fight each other instead of fighting the all-powerful government, which allows the all-powerful government to be a communist paradise where with examples of Vladimir Lenin and Stalin, these figures of communism were false communists. And what they do is they use the ideology of communism for the sake of their own power, not because they actually truly believe in communism, which Trotsky was someone who believed in the true idea of communism more. But what these people do is they use these communist tendencies and philosophies to boost their own power by taking power away from the individual. And in democracy, the individual has power over the government. So the government's trying to take away power from the individual so they cannot use their democratic privileges against them. The all-powerful government, or the all-powerful in waiting government, has taken away Christian values. And the reason this is really bad is because the moral foundation of the West comes from Christianity. It brings civilization. Even pagan civilizations like the Carthaginians and Romans before Christ, they were able to be civil because they had morals that were more aligned, like honor, with Christianity. And then those that fall to degeneracy because they stray away from more moral frameworks, they collapse in on themselves. And what's happening is the government does not want to be held accountable to a concept of God. And if the people believe in a concept of God, they will hold the government accountable to this concept. And the government does not want to be accountable. It wants all power, like all communist states. Similar to how the Bolsheviks took away Christianity when they came into power, because they want all the power. And when they take away the idea of God, then what happens to the idea of where morality comes from? If you take away the author of morality, or the concept of him in the minds of people, they then ask where it comes from, and then the idea of might makes right comes into play. Whoever's the strongest dictates what's good. And if the government's the strongest, they can make themselves gods on earth and create the world in their own image in this fantasy that they want to have. So they try to destroy God so they can become gods themselves. And they destroy the natives because they want to destroy resistance by bringing in foreigners to overtake the natives and destroy their values. And Islam, not all of it, but sects of it, are extremist, and they want to destroy even harder than normal immigrants, the natives of Europe and their descendants like America and Australia, the West in general. These communists are faking, pretending, playing as liberals and conservatives alike, more liberals, but still. They want to have endless wars to distract the native population from their problems. These communist skinwalkers are also very dumb in that they do not understand that the values of the Islamist extremists are to conquer even them. The communists who want to be the rulers of the world at any cost, turning their own nation into a third world state. In their minds, they think that they can rule over the immigrants they bring over because they are less likely to fight against them. However, what they do not take into account are the extremists that they bring in also. And these extremists, like what happened in Afghanistan, will take over the country from those who are in power, like the Shah in Iran. And they will usurp all of those things for their own governments because of their extreme ideologies. And most immigrants are not like this, but the extremist elements are able to, or have the opportunity to, rally more people to their side because of the common unity of Islam among a lot of those immigrants. So in a normal sense, the communists would be right in that they would have a greater opportunity to control the foreigners than the natives. But really, they're going to have a harder time controlling the Islamist extremists than the natives, because the Islamist extremists, once they get into more power and the communists try to consolidate their power by taking away the natives, they now have to deal with a new threat in the Islamists who will usurp them and attempt to establish a Islamist state in the Western nations. The rise and defeat of the Austrian painter was a great thing for the communists in the West, because they could then use the terms of being a National Socialist, a German National Socialist, and then copy and paste that onto anyone who refuses to agree with them, making them feel more guilty about themselves and being afraid to be called that and be shunned from society. No one wants to be called a German National Socialist, and being called that will be very bad since no one wants to work with you. You could lose your job. And so what these communist skinwalkers do is they use a feminine tactic that girls use against each other, where girls, when they are hostile, they are socially hostile, and they will use gossiping and shaming and gaslighting to manipulate and push down their enemies. And this is what the left does against their enemies. What these skinwalkers do is they use these tactics to convert their enemies to their side out of shame and not wanting to lose their job. And then they use their new recruits to do the same thing to everyone else. And anyone who disagrees with them they see as evil, because how can they be wrong? How can they be wrong if their opponent is someone that they call a National Socialist? So they applied the idea of the greatest of evils being anyone who disagrees with them, which makes it harder for those who are on the left and indoctrinated in the left to be willingly a person who looks into their opponent's ideologies, because they already have this base assumption that they are pure evil. Why would you analyze pure evil? It doesn't really make sense that you would, because you just already believe it's bad. And so over time, these skinwalkers take away any idea of pride and self-respect in their own people and nation, allowing for a smoother transition of hordes of immigrants to invade their country. However, there are a few small holdouts in the world, like Poland and Hungary, who still have pride in their nation and people and see through the woke nonsense and do not allow mass immigration to their country, and in fact do the opposite by deporting a lot of them who do go in there illegally. Poland has made it legal to use lethal force against immigrants who try to attack their border guards to get into the country, which is good because it's invasion. Russia is sending in thousands of immigrants to Poland to invade them, to destabilize them, because Poland is a historical rival of Russia, and it is a nation that is the gateway to Europe and blocks Russia from entering into Europe further. And so Poland being this last bastion, along with Hungary, in most senses of sanity, is something we should look forward to as a model to follow, not something to be hated like these Skinwalker-Communists insurgents say on the EU Council and UN. There is an idea called the blank slate, or the open view of the world, that the left uses. This idea is the idea that all humans are the same, which is false. The reason the left uses this idea is because they use it to say, if you take anyone from any place and put them in a Western state, they will act like a Western person. But that's not true, because these people from different places in the world have their own values, their own belief systems that are different than our own, and because of that will not assimilate unless they are forced to. And so the left uses the blank slate idea to further back up their false claims that it's a good idea to have mass immigration, and really they are only saying that for their own power and nothing else. And when they have their evil, maddening policies put in place, you can see in Keir Starmer's Britain, where you have colonies of the third world in England, and you see them tyrannizing the native English. They are conquering it. They push out the police and say, we can rule ourselves, we don't need you. So these microstates all over England are being created, these ethnic colonies, where England's being reverse colonized, and it's very bad. It's not okay. They do not deserve it. And when the British did have an empire, they were the most tolerant conquerors in the world. So even when they did conquer people, they were not abusive to the natives. And if they were at any degree, it was much less than the Islamic empires in the past, or the Mongol invaders, or I should actually say not the Mongols, the Huns, who just genocided people. So the British do not deserve to be forcibly colonized and destroyed. What the British did was actually bring civilization to the places they conquered, even when they did not need to. They did anyway. They helped the places they conquered become better, and because of that, these third world nations who used to be controlled by the British should be thankful. There was no idea of a national Indian identity until England conquered it and kept the whole thing as an Indian domain. So India should thank Britain for the idea of the unity of India when that did not exist beforehand. It was always divided. The decline of the West is it's not very dramatic. It's very melodramatic. It's very sickening and slow over time. Like how someone ages over time. That's how the West is sort of dying. There's this sickness that's being injected into them forcibly by higher-ups who are against the will of the natives, who always resist this, but they are being forcibly injected with poison. The poison of communism, of all these high taxes that no one wants, of all these immigrants no one wants. And they're forcibly poisoned over time. And with this, these Skinwalker-Communists hate their own blood and race, and they have no care about their own people or history. Their only personality trait is being a liar for their own gain. And when you have all these immigrants come in, the natives have to have higher taxes put on them to pay for these natives to live in free house, to pay for these immigrants to live in free housing. And these immigrants, a lot of them, like the Pakistanis and Afghanis, these Islamist extremists go around with these grooming gangs on an industrial scale, hurting these young British women and doing unspeakable acts to them. But the native has to pay for it to happen. And at the same time, anyone who critiques these horrible actions is the one who gets put in jail with extremely long sentences, but the people who actually do it get off free. This is an example of the white higher-ups, communist skinwalkers, hating their own blood and nation for the idea of getting more power, when they do not understand that even if they did get all the power they wanted, they would then have to fight the foreigners, extremists who they brought in, the Islamists who want to conquer and establish their own Islamic theocracy. Now, if you were bringing in foreigners who were not Muslim or not Muslim extremists, then you could, in a sense, try to have ultimate power over the foreigners because it would be easier. But when you're dealing with extremists who want to establish their own theocracy in Islam, you're going to have to fight them too. And so these communist skinwalkers are also dumb as well as evil, and they do not see and understand and recognize they are creating their own downfall, and they are selling their soul by sacrificing their natives upon the altar of this idea of power, when in the end they're going to lose all of that to the extremists that they bring in anyway. These communists have gradually, over a century, over decades, increased taxes, took away freedoms, like you now have to have licenses to go hunting, you have to have ID to do everything, you are not allowed to go outside and play, you cannot do fun things without the nanny state looking over you, and then they import hundreds of your enemies into your country and you're not allowed to say or do anything about it, or you're called a German National Socialist, shaming you into submission. And these Western nations are, like in England, specifically, England is too tyrannical to really fight back. And the communists are uniting with the Islamists, but it's to the communists' own demise. And this is all an attack on Christianity and freedom in the West for the sake of this idea that they won't even get, or if they get, it's going to be brief before they have to fight the extremists again. All these communist skinwalkers want power at any cost. They are cold and they have no sympathy for you, the native. They must be voted against, and their policies must be resisted, and if not, your nation will face extinction.